Okay, it is 11:31 on a beautiful afternoon. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We make sure you have something to eat, and especially the people in the back there, make sure to help yourself. We have lots of things. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us. And out of respect for people's time, we'll try to stick to our agenda. Item number one is the HVS feasibility analysis update. And if you want to, and Mike, maybe you want to start out with some comments, but then if you want to join us at that podium, that'd be great.
Well, I would just add good morning or good afternoon, task force members. Appreciate your time today. We're really excited to have HVS here in town today to really refresh some of the work that they performed for the city now nearly 5 years ago. And we think it's an important thing, as this task force has expressed too over time. It's important to understand market, understand feasibility, and this is an important contribution. This will be something that I think will be valuable for our work here, and it's something that will have some endurance. As we get this final report, we will build upon what was started in 14 and 15 and really have an enduring document. So I turn over to Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for bringing me.
If you don't mind, that microphone, if you can kind of get it as close to you as possible. And there you go. Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. So, we did, HVS did a study in 2015. And so we've been asked to do a quick review of that study and look at what may have changed that might affect those results. And so we've gone through that process. It's kind of an abbreviated update. We didn't redo the original report. I just reviewed what we did, looked at what might have changed underlying that, and to see if that would make a difference in our results, and also bringing it up in time. So I'd like to walk you through that. So first of all, what we did in the original study was we analyzed the market for a performance center. We did a series of interviews with stakeholders. We did them here in Fargo, and also contacted many over the phone. And we tried to interview everyone who was involved in performing arts in Fargo at that time. So for this study, JLG has done another outreach to stakeholders, and we have some results from that outreach that can augment the prior work. We evaluated alternative building programs, and the primary issue there was whether you would reuse the existing building or replace it. And we gravitated toward the replacement project, and that's what we recommended in our study based on two primary criteria. One was cost, and the other was the capabilities and capacity of the resulting facility. We projected event demand and the financial operations, and at that point we discussed a number of different ownership and operating arrangements for the facility, and I think there's been some evolution of thinking on that issue since we did our report. And then we discussed various approaches to financing, and there were some cost estimates provided in the study. And then we estimated the economic impact in the form of new spending that it would bring to the city of Fargo. So let's briefly walk through just some points where we think our prior work might have been affected and whether or not it should change. So first of all, we we defined the market as a drive-in market between 60, 90, and 120 minutes. So this would be typical of a venue of this sort in a community like Fargo that is really a regional center. You can see that drive time is here. So the numbers that you see on the screen are those that reflect those drive times, including the Fargo MSA. So this shows how the population and median household income has changed since 2015. So we've seen in that point somewhere between an 8 and 15% growth, depending on the radius you're looking at in population. We also had projections for 2020 in our prior study, and the 2018 numbers, actuals, are just below those 2020 projections. So it's been growing faster than what we had assumed in our underlying study. And the same story is true of median household income. It's also grown quite rapidly. Very impressive growth is what we're seeing. So that's all positive in terms of demand for performing arts center. There's more people with more money to spend on those kind of activities. We also then reviewed the Fargo-Moorhead performance venues to see what may have changed. This was a graphic that appeared in our original study, and there was little need to change that. But you can see the point of this was to show that most of the venues indicated in the blue have relatively small capacities, and the existing Civic Center with a 3,000 capacity, or the proposed with a 3,000 capacity, would be only smaller than the Shields and the Memorial Auditorium, which are very different in purpose. So, we also then looked at the capacity of the venues currently in the market. There were a couple changes since our last study, but we did nothing really notable. The Weld Auditorium at the university has been renovated. They got $628,000 for a renovation, so there have been some improvements there. And then we learned that the FMTC, which runs the stage at Island Park, has added a program which wasn't included in a venue which wasn't included in our 2015 report. That's the Studio 6 FMCT. Otherwise, we could have missed something, but we were not aware of any other changes in local venues. So that doesn't have any big impact on our findings.
Could I just add one quick thing? I just found out yesterday morning from the opera company that Weld Hall, even though they have this big refurbishing coming along, because of a change to the state university system and how they're paying their staff, they no longer can host outside groups. So for example, the opera usually has at least one of their programs there. They can't be in Weld anymore. So that can be kind of taken off the list for rental spaces.
Okay. Well, we assumed with the new venue that the opera would move from there to.
Right, but I'm just saying that,
But what are they
without
going to do
a
in the
new
meantime?
space,
Yeah.
our options keep doing this.
Yeah, creates some urgency about this, and then we also looked again at the comparable regional venues, and these were ones that appeared in our prior report, and there isn't any significant change in the capacity or new additions within this group since the time of our 2015 study. So you can see they range in seating capacity from about 1,700 to 2,400, 2,500 seats. But we did, and this is just a graphic on seating capacity. And I just happened to be in Amarillo recently, and I saw the Globe News Center, which I hadn't before. So I've seen most of these venues either prior to 2015 or recently. And Globe News Center is really a fascinating venue, but it's much smaller than what we're anticipating. It's purely for fine arts, smaller scale. We're looking here, we're interested in attracting Broadway shows, and so seating capacity of well over 2,000 is optimal for that in order to have the necessary capacity to accommodate those types of events. So we also then looked at the tendency of those comparable venues, and this venue would have all of those symphony, opera, ballet, Broadway series, potential university or school, and particularly the high schools would also be involved. So maybe that last category could be educational institutions, but they could all be involved. So this would have more multiple use than the comparable venues in other cities. And then since...
Quick question.
Yes.
And I'll bring it up while you're talking about these. We've got one, if you want to include it, it might be good, but it hits one actually in Palm Desert, California. And the only reason I bring it up is I'm guessing more Fargo people are familiar with that one than are with all of these others and have attended, and I can name several of our big donors that have been in it many times are possible, so it might be a good one to include. It's called the McCallum Center. And so a lot of locals are familiar with it.
Right. Yeah, our choice of these venues was driven in large part by, Midwest location
Proximity,
and
yep.
by population size. But yeah, there may be a lot of innovation in venue development that wouldn't be represented by these, many of which are older historic venues. So yeah, in terms of looking at the state of the art in terms of design and capacity and amenities, looking to other venues would make a lot of sense. So we did what we call the suitability analysis. This is a different analysis that wasn't in the report. So the say is, okay, so we're looking at all these other cities and they all have venues. Well, how does Fargo, which has the Civic Center but not really a venue that's comparable to these, how does it compare in terms of indicators of what kind of demand there would be for a performance center like this? And so we looked at issues of population and median household income for the city, and then we also looked at median age. Now, Fargo winds up at the bottom of that list, but for many types of events, for concerts, Broadway touring shows, the younger population is actually a strength. So you can think of this inverted, but for the classical arts, being older is a strength. So in this analysis, we inverted that and considered Fargo's low population as a benefit rather than a weakness. We also looked at, level of education is very indicative of participation in performing arts. And so we looked at college graduates, and a number of college graduates in Fargo has an above average number. Presence of the university is important there. We also looked, we have data on spending on entertainment, which it's a geographic-based index. It's based on the American Community Survey data. And if you have an index of 1, you're the average of entertainment spending in the U.S., yeah.
Can I just ask it, so for these, is it just Fargo, is it for the region, or is it just the city?
These are all city numbers.
Just the city of Fargo?
Yeah,
Well, that's
yeah.
very impressive. Thank
Sorry,
you.
these are, let me go back. I think they're MSA numbers.
Yeah, I was going to say MSA.
Yeah.
So is it the,
Metro area.
Yeah, this is MSA population of 251,000. So these are all MSAs.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. So in entertainment spending, all of these are below the national average in terms of what residents spend on entertainment, but Fargo is in the middle of the pack of those cities. And then expenditures on theater tickets is dollar amount that's spent on theater tickets in these various cities. Fargo, again, is in the middle of the pack now, but that may reflect a lack of venues right now and could conceivably move Fargo up. It seems to be lower than what the population would warrant, right? So when we combine all of those and do a ranking of them, and what we do is we create a ranking of the scale of 0 to 1 for each one of these. And Charleston turns out at the top, driven by population and college graduates and entertainment spending. So they have more spending. So they're kind of an outlier in this group. If you look at the rest of them in terms of their overall destination score, they're all around between 6 and 7, and Fargo's right in the middle of that. So it's this is consistent with the prior work that we did, but maybe refines it a little bit more. But indicates that Fargo is sort of lacking in facilities today because it doesn't have the comparable facilities to these other destinations, yet it has all the comparable destination characteristics. Any questions on that?
Which Charleston are you talking about?
West Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question? So basically, you would summarize that by saying, if you were looking at this as an investment opportunity, you would say this has the characteristics to be successful by looking at those numbers.
Yes.
That would be kind of a
Yeah, I
summary.
would. Yeah, I mean, when you say investment opportunity, it's a public investment, right? So
Correct.
It's, yeah. So you need to think about the return on the investment as the sort of the benefit to your residents and your community that's generated by what goes on in the facility, right? This is an update of the survey information. So we originally did all those interviews with stakeholders, and JLG made an effort to contact them again with a series of other questions. And you want to come up and talk about that a little bit more? These are our general conclusions, but it's the second item on the agenda, but it's really sort of also the middle part of this presentation. So I think we'll flip to that and discussion of those findings right now.
Yes, so Robert E. Mark, JLG Architects. As just a follow-up to the conversations that we've been having at the previous task force meetings, the list that was generated by this group, we did send out letters to the existing and new stakeholder lists. We did produce the survey, and we did get some follow-up responses. Varied responses, but all very supportive. So without getting into a lot of specifics, Michael is handing out the current responses. With that, it's nice. You can see who that was, what organization they're with, and I would just ask the task force if there's somebody that you would like input for, or if you see a specific question that is from an entity or a group that you are associated with that you think would be appropriate to follow up with. That would be beneficial just to the continued development of the project. By and large, you'll see that that there was the continued direction, that there's growing audiences, that there's some new offerings, as these groups continue to develop and continue to grow and prosper, that they're creating some new opportunities, some different size shows. You'll continue to see that there is always a technical side to the responses that's saying, hey, we need the acoustics, we need it to be both to be able to perform incredibly from a non-mic'd sort of standpoint, as well as a fully acoustic provided theory. So there's a lot of different information. I think it just runs very parallel to the feedback that was put in the 2015 study, but it reaffirms that there's this investment. From the new stakeholders list, you'll see that a lot of the groups come from, there was a lot of feedback from the Fargo Public Schools. Again, the new list really went out to the mayors of the communities. It went out to the presidents of the universities and superintendents, and got spread out kind of from there. The survey is still live on the website. It hasn't been blasted just globally, because we wanted to make sure that the results supported the HVS study and was information that could help support the presentation and the direction that the task force has already progressed. So if there's any specific questions as you review that, happy to receive any emails. Send them directly to myself or Michael, and we'll make sure that we respond. We'd also like to just issue some thank you letters on behalf of the task force. So we'll reach out to the people that took time and responded, and just send an email confirmation that we received their response and that we appreciate the feedback. And if there's any questions that were asked that are just easy to answer or related to timeline, we'll be sure just to share that.
Can I ask you, could you give us maybe a couple of the key things that you received, like what you think we should hear, I guess like the top few of those, if you don't mind?
So the top few items would be that that there's flexibility and affordability. So one, that the space can be used for a lot of different functions. From the new stakeholders, it was a lot about collaboration. So it's these opportunities to host an event, and we've heard the same thing from the task force in prior meetings too, to be able to, a group concert series or orchestra, something that they don't currently have the facility space for to do now. It would be incredible for them to be able to get their 3 different high school orchestras together and present together, and having a facility like that. There's also just a lot of comments about just making sure that due diligence is done to make sure that it's done right, and that it can be functional for the different users. So I think one thing that came out of this, reading all these, is really focusing on those users and reviewing the program with the task force to say, okay, we do recognize that these are maybe our top X users and the program requirements that they really demand to be successful. Going back to kind of how sound is handled, that's a big component. Going back to flexibility, flexible seating, that's an option that was studied in great detail in 2015. That still is a component that is being brought up. The other thing that's being brought up is a diversity of size spaces. So discussion about black box theater or other presentation-related program spaces to be able to really thrive. One thing that came out of this as well that I would draw attention to is the need for being able to, set up in the space and then have the supporting space that can really work on behalf of many different presentation types. So thinking through that's going to be, part of the challenge as we move forward.
Can I just add one thing real quick? I think one of the challenges, this is down the road a little bit, there's a lot of people that will want to use this place, but there's a lot of people that don't have a lot of money that are going to want to use it and not have to pay a lot. And I think part of it is going to be, it has to be a financially viable building like the Fargo Dome, but we also want it to be an asset that these other groups that want to use it that don't have a lot of money can use the facility. I do think that will be a challenge to even set the price for, is there a separate price list for the for-profit versus the public education groups, or I don't know if that makes sense to people, but I do think that will be a challenge because from Rob's perspective, that takes a lot of man hours. If you want to customize the auditorium space for non-microphone, well, somebody has to do that, and to set up the building, and all that costs money. And Linda, maybe you could talk to this, not to single you out, but there's some groups that will want to use that, but don't have a lot of. So I think that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a community asset, but it also has to be financially viable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's not a performing organization in this town that currently is sitting on a really solid financial footing. So if rental of a venue is, kind of out of reach, it kind of defeats the purpose. It'll have to be just worked into.
And I do think this kind of ties into what our last item on the agenda is, the fundraising part of this. And I think, we talk about the capital to build the building, but I think part of it should be talked about. Some of it could be used for funding these viable groups, but to have that go to financial assistance to help them be in the building, or I don't know if that makes sense, but something along that line. And I do think we're fortunate. I think a lot of these other buildings they're already existing, and so we can copy. I'm guessing they have the same issues, and hopefully we can copy what they've done. And especially when Linda talked about Sioux Falls, but there's other ones that I'm sure they have the same thing. And so if there's lessons we can learn from them, that would be a good thing. So I apologize for talking too much, but I just think that is an issue that even if we build the building, the people that want to use it, that will be a challenge. Thanks. And if anybody has any other comments, please speak up. But maybe you want to address that if you don't mind a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head, and as you review especially the new stakeholder information, you'll see that comment comes up time and time again, and it's highlighted here as if affordable, continued interest in the Performance Center if affordable, and it's touching on that exact need, recognizing, hey, we don't have a lot of funds to create these amazing experiences, but we do know that we could take them the next step further if we had the space to host them in. But that's going to be limited by availability and cost. So,
if I could add, there's a trade-off in terms of the capital expenditure, initial capital expenditure, and your ongoing operational expenditures. Just to give a specific example, I mentioned the Globe Theater in Amarillo. It has this elaborate shell that is used for certain types of performances for symphony, but then for Broadway or whatever or a theater production, they would move it back. Well, this shell is actually on cables, and with a push of a button, within 2 minutes, that shell can be put in place. So the amount of labor that's necessary to do that is quite minimal, where it may take hours in other theaters to take a shell from some other location, bring it in, or maybe from storage, and it might take hours of labor in order to get that done. There's like a million little different issues like that you might encounter, and one of I think the tendencies is to try to value engineer stuff out of it, but that then has future impacts for overall life cycle costs. So I think when it comes to designing it, that's really important to keep the life cycle costs in mind. And if you have a venue that operates very efficiently, your ability to accommodate groups at lower rental rates is going to be higher and serve the community better. Any other questions on the survey? So for us, our takeaway from the survey was that it was largely consistent with interview of 2015 stakeholders, if not reflecting a little bit of growth in arts activities. There were a couple mentions of that, but nothing that we thought really moved the needle real hard on our earlier demand projections. So I'll jump into those. This is the demand projection. So what we assumed for the purposes of future estimation that this timeline would move out, there would be a 2022 opening. Now that's just an assumption for the purposes of doing the analysis. We don't have a timeline for funding or for construction schedule, but it pushes it out a few years. So, and we're assuming it takes 4 years to get the venue fully utilized. So it assumes there's 20 up to 20, growing from 20 to 28 concerts and entertainment events. Many of those might already be occurring at the Fargo Dome and move over, but many of them will be new. Particularly touring Broadway stuff will be much more likely to book here, and the concerts would also be of a wider variety. Would be much more likely to book in a venue like this, and then we have symphony, opera, ballet, and dance. Those are resident companies that they're based on their current level of activities. And then we have local theater. If anything, that the surveys indicated that if there's more school utilization, those numbers might be higher, potentially higher. Assemblies would include the graduations and other types of assemblies. And then there would be capacity for banquets and social events, especially because we had recommended a separate black box theater, which also could serve as a function space. So you could get up to close to 160 events, attracting over 100,000 attendees per year. So that's very much like our prior estimates. We didn't move them up or down.
Can I ask a question real quick? And this is for Rob. So this looks very similar to what we, kind of what we look at the Finance Committee at the Fargo Dome. Do those numbers, I mean, obviously not everything is directly similar to the Dome, but does that look similar to what you would project? Especially, I'm thinking of the Gate City Bank Theater and things like that.
Well, I probably should say yes, because we worked with Tom when this was created. With regards to the concert and entertainment, the touring theater, definitely it's aggressive, but, speaking with our current promoter of jam theatricals, with Fargo doing 5 to 7 Broadway shows a year at the Gate City Theater, that definitely would increase not only in the amount of shows, types of shows, but even instead of a 1 day, it might be a 2 or 3 day run, which obviously becomes more. The concerts, this size entertainment venue is absent right now from the market, so there's definitely a market for that as well.
So can I ask you, like the 2,500 seat concert, so is that something that you come across now that obviously that doesn't fit in the Dome usually? Is that something that you see there'd be more than a handful of those potentially?
Oh, there'd definitely be more than a handful. We don't have much conversation on it right now. Most promoters out there know that venue's not available here in Fargo at times. They've got the Civic Center that some will look at. Even Shields Arena, when you're looking at a 2,000 to 2,500 seat show, Shields Arena at 45 to 5 starts to get too big for that as well.
And I do think that ties in with what you were talking about, the number of tickets sold, and Linda had the good information about when they built the new facility, they sold a lot more tickets just because it's a good venue to attend. And so I do think that's part of, you showed the number where the number of tickets sold in our area was really lower, and it's because we don't have, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, yeah, okay. So we then looked at, we adjusted our financial projections, and we first of all, we use the impact of inflation on the number. So we use actual CPI from 15 going forward, and then we assumed inflation rate of 2.5% going forward. So that acts on all of these numbers. Now, the other big question, I think, is one of management, and so getting into the idea that this would not be managed by a third party, which is what we assumed last time, that it would be managed internally. So at that time, Fargo-Dome was managed by a third party, and that's subsequently changed. So we assumed that there would be a similar approach here. So it eliminated the management fee. We didn't bring up, there could be other costs that might be higher with management, but then there's offsetting costs if it were like managed jointly with the Fargo-Dome. And we really haven't sorted those issues out in this pro forma, but I think that's something that in a further work we would want to look more closely at, saying, yes, this is a management structure we're going to use. This is the ownership structure we're going to have, and then look very specifically at, let's say it were managed jointly with the Fargo-Dome, what impact that would have on this pro forma. So I think that could be a change. But what we're showing here is that it is sustainable as an operation. So you basically get to a break-even operation, which is a reasonable goal for a facility like this. It is completely unreasonable to expect that it could generate sufficient income to support its capital development. That's not going to happen. It doesn't happen in any theater. That's why, fundraising and public participation in development of these theaters is so universal, right? So, but it's showing that in this market, given these set of cost assumptions, that you do have an ongoing viable operation that isn't going to be a big drain on the city's general fund. It should be fairly standalone in its operation. And there could be things that you might innovate to improve this picture. There could be things we're not thinking about well enough that could, change this. But I think as we refine this, it's at least the initial picture is pretty positive. So then, and then we also just brought our visitor spending. Since our demand estimates didn't change a lot, we just updated for inflation the new visitor spending numbers. So it's going to track some overnight stays as a regional center. So we estimated that they're going to be spending about $127 a day per visitor when they're here. And day trip visitors might spend around $70 a day in these various categories. We then estimated gross direct spending that would occur from overnight spending, from delegate spending, and then there's facility revenue, which we haven't double counted here, because we've taken out the spending that delegates or visitors would spend on the facility in their spending numbers. So the facility revenue is also an impact. So generating up to $5 million a year in annual gross direct spending, but not all of that necessarily lands in Fargo. So we like, for example, if someone buys a novelty and that novelty is made in China, that plus the tariff amount will go to will not land in Fargo, right? So the net direct spending is smaller than the gross, and then there's indirect spending, which is new business spending associated with it. So, so a visitor comes and spends money on a restaurant, the restaurant has to buy the food, and other supplies. To the extent that's done in Fargo, that becomes an indirect impact. And also, there's new income generated. A wait staff may have more income. If they spend that in Fargo, that is an indirect benefit. So we use an input-output model to estimate that. And so those numbers are about, we estimate about a $7 million a year, once it's stabilized, a $7 million a year impact. That's stated in 2019 dollars. The numbers you saw earlier were in 2015 dollars. So these are a little bit bigger, but it's primarily the impact of inflation acting on the numbers. So that is the extent of the update we've done, and like to
Can I ask you to go back again? Because to me, those are huge. This is the one about the daily, the visitor spending, that's what's not going on right now. And so if this building is built and we start having events, to me, that's fantastic. And I think it's very important.
Yeah, so remember, this is for the city of Fargo. So if you were in a city of Chicago, you wouldn't see numbers like this because we're not counting people from Fargo who spend. We're talking about people who come from outside of the city. So that's West Fargo. It's everybody in that 120-mile radius that's not in Fargo that's coming to these events. And this is that kind of regional draw, sub-regional draw. So that's what's driving these numbers to be higher than what you might typically see in a performing arts center.
The only thing I didn't like, it was retail spending, I think was $8.91. What do they buy for $8.91?
It's averages, right?
Oh,
So
it's an average, okay.
Tom, can you go back to that, the one with the hotel rate and stuff on it?
So-
That's low.
Well,
The
but
hotel daily
that
rate
is
low.
per person. So
Per person,
that's
okay.
per
So you're-
person. So we have to take it by the room. I can't
Multiple
remember what
occupancy.
number, but you divide the ADR by 1.5 or 1.75 or something like that. to
The
get
ADR
this
is about 85 bucks right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
That's
So
a
it's
hotel
about
That
1.5
makes sense.
persons, assuming 1.5 persons per room.
Have you broken this down to how much revenue the community will receive from new events versus ones that already exist in other venues?
That's a good question. So what you're saying, to the extent that, let's say, there's events at Fargo Dome that are coming over
They're
this
already
venue.
happening in
Yeah.
town.
Yeah, we haven't factored that out of these numbers. That's a really good point.
Well, I'd just say at first blush, these are extremely conservative figures, and they're the kind we like, because when people ask us to project things, we won't even mention the words economic impact unless we've commissioned a study for it. We talk about direct spending, and for like sporting events, we use a direct spend of like $225 for a hotel room, but for sporting events, and that includes a hotel room. But we're assuming 4 people in a room, probably in that case, so they're going to spend more outside, and it's very conservative. I think this is really conservative, which is a good way to project it.
And John, reading that survey, it said, are there other things outside of what your organization is currently doing that this would be used? And I mean, everybody, absolutely, oh my, yes, absolutely, yes, 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 yes. So it seems like everybody's already brainstorming what else could be done here.
Yeah, there's nothing but enthusiasm from the arts groups, as long as they don't have to pay for it, right?
How big a concern is it that NDSU's blanket answer is no, they wouldn't use it? Is that expected, and would that be the same for other universities?
Yes, I think it's typical. NDSU has a lot of their own venues, and so and similar to other groups, if they have a venue they can use that they've already paid for, they would have little incentive unless there were capabilities in this venue that they just don't have.
I could answer that a little bit. I noticed that it was Dean Brashani that answered that, but I don't know if he is aware that already choral groups go off campus to perform at his choral groups go off campus to perform at places with better acoustics. There are the kinds of large-scale works that the music theater departments could collaborate and put on that they can't in festivals. So several years ago when we took a run at studying this, we talked to the ensemble directors, and there was quite a bit of excitement, even from Concordia, of getting off the campus and doing some special large-scale works so I wouldn't take that as a super hard no.
If I could add one more comment on impact. These are quantifiable impacts. Like we can take good, get a pretty good idea of what people spend when they come and how many people are going to do that. But there is another set of impacts that aren't quantifiable, and that's the impact on the residents and their quality of life and their enjoyment. And you can extend that to notions of employee attraction, right? Having a venue where people can have entertainment they want makes it a more attractive place to live. And for existing residents, I mean, you think about the value of, kids becoming familiar with classical music or seeing theater for the first time, what an educational impact that has. And also the impact it has on social cohesion. All those kind of issues are really what these facilities are about. It's really not about attracting spending from outside. It's really about enhancing the quality of life of residents. And so I think that there's a danger in looking at these numbers and losing sight of the real fundamental purpose of the facility.
There are a couple other facilities we might just put on our radar. I don't know much about it, the TAC music venue in Dilworth.
In where?
In TAC, T-A-K. There's a music venue between Moorhead and Dilworth called TAC. And I understand the Fargo Brewing Company is going to become a venue with Jade Presents. So we just might want to engage and see what their intentions are.
Okay.
And I don't know if I noticed Avalon West there or not, if that's a contender just to study their, the old hub bar. Avalon West is a multi-venue. I don't think I saw Shields on there, did I? Was it on there? Okay.
Yeah, Shields is on there. Yep. Okay, we'll look at those.
I had a question. When you went to the operational pro forma, you said you hadn't done much of a deep dive into the integration of the dome, or so this is all being modeled independently. I'm just wondering what impact that has, and maybe this is a little bit on Rob. If the dome has been brought inside and is now just another department of the city, then there's got to be some cost savings that could be carved out of the operational pro forma, if you will, and it would probably take it out of a negative position that you're showing now. But I just want to let the committee know that that's probably a possibility. And then I saw you had a capital reserve on the bottom. I'm assuming that's your capital spend every year as opposed to just saving up money, or is that saving up money?
That was intended to save up money. There's a maintenance line item for your ongoing expenditures just to keep the facility in good condition. But this would be for major capital. Okay. A 10-year replacement of equipment, of mechanical equipment, let's say, something like that. So that's what that reserve is about.
Okay, and my point to the committee is if these are tightly aligned and consolidated, basically from an operational perspective, it would seem like the results would be better than what he's showing. So just something to keep in mind. And then also, obviously, we have a $100 million general fund budget, and everybody competes for capital dollars as well on an annual basis, so the commission might choose to look at this somewhat differently and consider a contribution, capital contribution to this venue too. So there's lots of opportunity here.
Can I ask a question for Mike? Mike, will this be on the city website? I do think this information, there's a lot of good stuff here, and so how will that go?
Mr. Chair, we'd be happy to do that and put this slide deck and any other additional material in the surveys, on that same website that we put some of our other previous presentation. So happy to do that.
Any other comments or questions? The other side of the table seems kind of quiet. Are you shell-shocked because of all the information? Or anyway, you're welcome to comment.
I do have one question in regards to, is this, and I should have done more research on this, but this isn't something that we could utilize an opportunity zone funding for? No, that has to be housing, is that?
Jim was rubbing his eyes while the question was being asked.
Did I make you cry, Jim? I'm sorry.
I missed the question. Go ahead.
So is this opportunity zone funding capability with the Performing Arts Center?
Yeah, the Opportunity Zone is really set up, or opportunity funds are really for private sector investors to invest in private sector facilities or businesses. So while you get a tax deduction, if you invest in an opportunity fund, the people expect a return on their investment. And so, again, as you noted, this is going to require more public financing or donations to actually construct it. That there won't be enough return on the operations to pay for any capital.
Okay. Thank you.
If I could add, it would certainly, qualify for tax exempt financing, especially if we're run by a nonprofit or by the city. If you had that ownership structure, it would qualify for tax. So that federal tax exemption would be a benefit to this project, like it is to any municipally financed project.
Very good. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we'll move on to the last item on the agenda, and kind of a lot of the questions will cross over from one to the other. And so it's number 3, fundraising and capital campaign framework and approach, once again with JLG. And Mike, maybe you want to start with that again?
I'll set that up. And the other topic that we need to revisit, it's one that we were scheduled to discuss in March, but we pushed back due to Ken having to be out in Bismarck. But we also want to talk about other conventional municipal financing tools and mechanisms to that earlier question about tax-exempt financing. And so we would bring that back at our meeting in June. And so we'll put Kent on that agenda. But this is really a continuation on fundraising of a discussion that we started in March. We did get through some, I think, some early thoughts that Rob had just about how to approach this question of consultant resources, not consultant resources, and how much work the group wanted to take on its own as well, with just direct outreach to some potential major funders for this facility. So you've got the survey results from the folks who are potential users of the facility. We don't have, I think, a similar handle on the major capital investment opportunities in the private sector. We have some ideas, but we don't have a firm grasp of if we think there's $5 million of eligible private spend here, $15 million, et cetera. So that's just really still an open question following our discussion back in March. Rob, anything you'd like to add to that? Does that kind of cover it?
So, Mike, can I ask you a couple questions? So one of them is, I think we have to start getting a finer tuned number, and I know that's challenging, but at a certain point, when you start talking about fundraising, you have to start knowing what's the target. And I think the other discussion is, do we want to have an outside fundraising group? Are there fundraising groups that specialize in this type of facility? Those types of things. And another one is, so the city, what is going to be our part? Because the way I look at it, one part of the city share is the site, and also the management. And so I think there's a lot of things that we can start getting a little bit finer tuned to knowing the numbers. Because once you start asking people for money, and I think the whole topic of, well, what if we have some of the capital fund go towards helping fund some of these lower income groups use the facility? I think if we build a really nice facility and no one can afford to rent it, it's not going to be very busy. So there's a lot of those type of questions. And so I'm sorry if I'm rambling too much, but those are just a few of the topics. And if anybody else has some other ones to bring up, I think those are all things. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add too, we had a really good discussion, the mayor and I, with Linda about a month ago, not to put Linda on the spot, but just about, there's probably a variety of approaches in that continuum of, even with fundraising consultants, do you want to go with more of the homegrown kind of known commodity, people that we've worked with previously in this market, or more of a national consultancy, somebody that's coming in from from Detroit, from Cleveland, wherever it might be, to try help just establish a baseline of what's there, and then take a commission off that work. And so there's a variety of approaches there, but I would agree with you, Commissioner Pepcorn, that it really does start first with what's the available revenue capacity of city. That really is what it's going to point back to. We have had a variety of capital projects. I'll just use one as an example. This year, our border states property for the police headquarters. We handle a lot of capital internally, and I think Tom's point is well taken. This project likely would not be expected to cash flow its capital and meet that in the pro forma expectation. But that said, what's the city's level of effort? And could that be something that is on a magnitude or a scale of a 50% shareholder, 75%, or something less than that? That's both a political and a policy question, as well as a capacity question that I think, Kent and I don't know, Kent, if you want to weigh in on that. I think I'm kind of covering the bases on that, but that's a large question, so.
Yeah, certainly the insertion of a very large debt service payment into our general fund budget would be problematic, and would placing it at a very high priority and compared to our normal things. I mean, we certainly do have some capacity, but everything in proportion to the needs of the city, and that's an ongoing challenge. And good news is there's resource there. Bad news is you got to decide how to allocate it proportionately. And we always seem to work that out one way or the other. We just absorbed I think it was about a $1.7 million debt service payment for this facility that was just completed after 4 years of construction, and got in at a time when the interest rates were very low, and that worked in our favor. So, that's a good thing. Interest rates are still low. Tax-exempt financing is still available and will be. So, there are some valid points too, but just that proportionate share, and in my mind, what we would probably model out would be just starting the gross minus an assumed fundraising contribution level, and then what's the impact of that debt service payment on the general fund, and what's the appetite for ramping it up or trying to constrain it as much as possible. And that's a kind of a political discussion that the budget team and the city commission would have to ultimately deal with. So we'll bring some of that to you in June.
Yeah, I would just suggest too, and we talked about this in March, and then we had an intervening flood event in there, but perhaps we could take a couple of folks that are interested from this task force and having some more in-depth conversation about it, just to kind of look at some of Kent's spreadsheets. As we get it ready for our budget process, it's hard to believe we're already talking about 2020, but we are starting our budget process, and I think it'll just kind of help if we could pull a couple of folks from this task force just to show the baseline of where we start, kind of conceptualizing our big picture. I call it the big tectonic plates of revenue, and kind of where those tectonic plates are today, where we expect them to be in 20 and 21. I think that that'd be really helpful. But I certainly look to the task force for some thoughts that you might have on just what that proportion of public to private looks like. And but I really want to echo what Tom said. I think in our brief analysis and summary, as well as the 10 other peer cities and facilities that he put on the board, this is a pretty common practice that there is a lot of public participation, and that that debt service, especially on the capital side, that these are facilities that typically get a lot of public support to improve them, to add on to them, to make them the kinds of facilities that communities are proud of. So I think that would be a feature certainly here too.
Okay, where do we go from here, Mike? What's our marching orders? What's our plan of attack? What do you?
Ken, I think it.
I had a follow-up question. Maybe this is to the consultants, and forgive me if I haven't followed up on maybe what you've already provided, but have you shown some capital financing models in your previous work for all these facilities? Like, what's the mix of public participation and fundraising percentages, proportions? I mean, we're kind of shadow boxing if we don't have some of that information available to us.
Yeah, our prior work presented a set of case studies, which included information on how each one of them were funded.
Okay.
We didn't recommend a specific funding plan. That we have to be a little careful about that. We're not financial advisors, and so you would need certified financial advisor to actually move into that phase of work. But I think those examples in their prior study would be helpful. It just shows that there's a large component of fundraising and or public expenditure on these facilities is a upshot of that. Those cases.
Is that a mix of those people on the list that you showed us, comparables? And is there a case study for each one, or did you just hand pick a few?
I can't remember exactly how many, but there's a half a dozen case studies of different financings of many of those venues that you saw. Yeah.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe as we proceed, I'm just again, brainstorming, a subcommittee set up to come back with some sort of a model, and maybe it's a combination of what these are. Maybe there's a median way of financing these, or maybe there's one in the mix that we would model it after, and then come back, rather than the entire, a small subcommittee with Kent maybe leading, and come back with a format to be tweaked by the general group, and maybe propose it at either the June or July meeting. And I think Dave's correct. We need to move sort of fast. If we don't know the financial model and an approximate cost, et cetera, there's not much reason to move too much further if we don't have some substance to our fundraising plan or a model.
And can I ask, the challenge is, so we kind of know what the building is going to look like, but we still, how hard is it to get a ballpark number, or do you hesitate to even go in that direction? But I think at a certain point, you have to start knowing what are we shooting for? Because I think until that point, and I know it's a challenge, and we don't know the specific until you do the bids, but can't we do approximate?
Yep, absolutely. In the previous study, to support the feasibility piece coming up, then the next step again was to estimate based off the square footage, and the program utilized a cost for the construction of the actual capital project itself. And that is in the previous 2015 study, and will be updated and presented at the next commission meeting as well. So that work is in progress. McGough Construction here has generously offered some support to that previously, and also has expressed their interest in preliminary document doing the same thing. And so they bring the numbers up for this facility, as well as provide 6 different comparable facilities that they've worked on to show that those are really accurate numbers that we can see in case study.
So you will say at our next meeting, then we'll have a closer thing. And so can I ask you, so right now, I mean, we were talking ahead of this, that we kind of know a few more known commodities now. We know the site, or the preferred site. We also know kind of the neighboring buildings, and I do think the skyways, how we include that, and who pays for that, I think that's a question that we should have answered. But like just the demolition and all that, we know that where we're going. And so to me, some of those numbers should be a little easier to determine. Does that make sense? I don't know that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I think the sideboards are put up a little bit more firmly. You know, from where we started this process several months ago, we have, especially with that site identification, I think we know a lot more now. And I think the other comment I was going to make, so in addition to that construction estimating outreach, Kent and I, well, most recently, we're just in touch with Baker Tilly, which is the new firm name for Springstead, and our financial advisor. And I think that we do a call with Baker Tilly just to try and run some numbers and see what a couple of sample performas would look like. And also talk to Rob, too, about some of the Fargo Dome work that's currently underway. So just, I do think there's more that we can talk about, certainly on the finance side. And if it's okay, Mr. Chair, if we could nominate, you know, a couple of folks from this group to do that, who would want to sit in on that and help us out?
Can I add one more thing? And I guess I can, since I'm the chairman. But the parking thing, a lot of people are going to ask the question, well, do we have enough parking, blah, blah, blah. But for 2,500 customers, how much, now we're connected. Let's say this is connected with the Skyway. How many spots do we have in our current indoor parking ramps, including the new Block 9 ramp, would we have available for that facility? Do you get what excuse me, I think that would be a good answer to have. Do we have enough capacity already with our ramps to provide? I guess, and I don't know if you remember that. I've asked this before, what the number is for 2,500 people, how many parking spots approximately?
Are you asking me how many you think you need, or how many you have in your ramps? Because I got no idea on that.
No, how many you need?
You know, for most events like this, you figure somewhere between 2 and 4 a car. So that's going to put you at 400 to 700 spots for most events, for your capacity event.
And aren't most of our ramps, Jim, open in the evening?
Yeah, you know, they've been open in the evening now. You know, when there's events at the Civic, we do charge for parking at the Civic Center ramp, and so the Civic Center ramp next door, there's 250 there. You know, maybe half of it's used by the hotel. Block 9, there's 300, and there'll be about 380. You know, maybe 100 get used by the hotel. Roberts Commons is 455. Probably 150 are used overnight by apartments. The proposed mercantile ramp will have 370, and probably 300 open in the evening. The ground transportation center, there's 180 that are all open in the evening. So, within that 2 to 3 blocks, we're going to be well over that 800 number.
Are you going to have them all front door? No, but
That doesn't even count what's
most
on the
venues
street.
don't have that. It's, the Fargo Dome is a rarity, more so in major facilities that having 4,000 on-site parking spots. But you go to downtown Minneapolis with all of the performance centers they have there, whether it's First Avenue, Pantages, all of that, they don't have any dedicated parking. It's all ramp parking within 3 to 10 blocks of the facility, and that's on purpose. And that also is part of the impact down here as well, to get those people to walk to and from those areas and going past the different establishments.
Another person I'd suggest for this initial discussion for financial approaching would be Commissioner Grinberg. When this came before the City Commission, he presented us a white sheet of what he suggested this all should look like. And not that we should at least include him up front so that we're considering his concerns and his recommendations relative to how this is funded.
Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, so Mike, will you kind of give us our marching orders from here, what the plan is?
So next up, we do have one more meeting that is on the calendar, and that's Tuesday, June 11. And we didn't schedule any meetings after that in the summer months, but we do have one more that is scheduled. That, like I said, the earlier topic that got postponed, Kent's, that's really one of the last remaining and outstanding items. We've covered a lot of ground here. I'm going to start summarizing this in the form of a final report for the task force. But I think the idea would be if we could pull a couple of folks, we'll do that. We'll have an intervening meeting here, maybe right before Memorial Day, and then come back, have that summarized. And that would be really the bulk of that meeting on Tuesday, June 11. If there's other topics, certainly we can agendize those as well if folks have other things that they'd like to talk about here.
Is there an issue anybody else would like to have brought up or covered, or are we happy with how the directions are going, Kent?
Did I hear the consultant say that you were going to bring forward some more information on the capital financing at the next meeting? I thought I heard you say that. And if so, if I'm supposed to give some presentation on the city's capacity, we need to look at that data, get our head around that a little bit. Was that a yes or a no?
Well, we could bring forward information on those case studies.
Okay.
But in the other, of course, important piece is the actual capital amounts, which would be presented at the next meeting. But you might want to talk about the timing of that. If maybe that information shared earlier, so that there's an ability then to.
Correct. Correct. As discussed here, the intent would be for a small group to work with you, Kent, to look through those numbers as well as look at that financing number and then provide that information to the task force. So yes.
Okay, that's very helpful because I just was thinking of the staging of the information. If you were going to present on the same day and we didn't coordinate, that would be a little awkward.
No, we need to really bring this together, and I think, try to bring some of these sort of disparate pieces into a final package on the finance side and have a final statement on that.
Do we want to name a subcommittee now for people who want to work on financing, or do we want to wait till after we get a more sense of what others have done? There's probably some people at the table here that are maybe willing to volunteer.
Can we leave that to the discretion of Mike and Kent and maybe add? Yeah.
Yep.
Anybody that wants to volunteer, please contact either Mike or Kent, and we'll go from there.
I hope, Brad, you're on that list.
Very good. I think that's good. Thank everybody for coming. It's 12:35. I really appreciate you volunteering your time, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity, and so hopefully you're all enjoying it. And I apologize for the last meeting. It was because of the flood issues, so we postponed it, but I think that was a good thing anyway. It gave us a little bit extra time. So do we know the date of the next meeting or not yet?
Tuesday, June 11.
Very good. Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.